The Montreal Screwjob is legendary in professional wrestling, not just for what happened, but for why it happened and whether it was even real. It's a singular moment where the lines between reality and storytelling blurred so perfectly that it became the ultimate wrestling story. Here's a breakdown of why it might be the greatest wrestling story ever, and why we still don't know if it was real or or maybe both. The basics. What happened? At Survivor Series 1997 in Montreal, Bret the Hitman Hart was set to defend the WWF Championship against Shawn Michaels. Bret was leaving for WCW, but he didn't want to lose in Canada. He had creative control in his contract for his final 30 days and agreed to drop the title later. Vince McMahon didn't trust that he would, and conspired with Shawn and referee Earl Hebner to end the match early, signaling for the bell when Bret was in the sharpshooter, his own finishing move. Even though he hadn't tapped, that moment caught live showed Bret spitting on Vince, trashing ringside gear, and later punching him backstage. But decades later, fans and insiders still ask, was it real or a work? If it was real, a legitimate double cross. If the Screwjob was real, it was the most cold-blooded business move in wrestling history. Vince McMahon couldn't afford to risk his championess howling up on WCW Nitro with the WWF belt like Medusa had done with the women's title. Shawn Michaels got to leave Montreal with the title and a massive heat boost. Bret Hart became a martyr, wronged in his own country, screwed by the boss, and beloved by fans for standing his ground. This version of the story is one of betrayal, power, and real-life consequences. And in a twisted way, everyone still won. Vince McMahon used it to become the evil Mr. McMahon character, kicking off the Attitude Era. Shawn Michaels became the company's top heel. Bret Hart, despite a disappointing WCW run, became a legend of integrity and honor. WWF surged in ratings and popularity, turning the tide in the Monday Night Wars. So even if it was real, it created the most compelling moment in wrestling history, and the fallout helped reshape the industry. If it was a work, the ultimate con is where it gets wild. There's a theory that everyone, Bret, Shawn, Vince, was in on it, that they orchestrated the most convincing real moment in wrestling history to create buzz, blur reality, and light a fire under WWF. Signs that support this. Bret just happened to have a documentary crew following him wrestling with shadows. Shawn immediately denied involvement, then years later admitted he was in on it. Was that part of the long-term work? Vince got punched by Bret, but what better way to cement the betrayal? Everyone involved benefited massively from the fallout. Bret became a folk hero. Vince became the top heel in wrestling. Shawn was back on top. If it was all a work, it was a brilliant one. A work where they worked the boys, the fans, and even themselves into playing it straight. That's Shakespearean-level meta-storytelling. Why it's the best wrestling story ever. It blurs the line between reality and kayfabe better than anything else ever has. There is still no definitive answer. That ambiguity is the magic. It launched the Mr. McMahon character, the Attitude Era, and gave wrestling an edge it had never had before. It has been retold, referenced, and echoed in dozens of storylines since nothing has come close. It's the example people use when trying to explain the depth of storytelling wrestling can achieve. Everyone came out on top. Vince McMahon became the biggest heel in the industry and turned WWF into a cultural juggernaut. Shawn Michaels kept his spot, enhanced his character, and leaned into the heat. Bret Hart got paid big money by WCW, became a real-life hero, and solidified his legacy. The fans got the most unforgettable moment in wrestling history. The industry got a storyline so perfect it may have saved WWF from going under. Whether it was a shoot, a work, or something in between, the Montreal Screwjob is wrestling's version of a magic trick you still can't figure out. The fact that we'll never know the full truth makes it timeless and maybe the greatest story the industry will ever tell. Want to dive deeper into the clues and contradictions? Let's dig into the weird, murky rabbit hole of the Montreal Screwjob, because if this was a work, it's the deepest con wrestling ever pulled. And if it wasn't, then somehow, real-life betrayal still managed to produce the most perfect wrestling angle of all time. Here's a breakdown of the biggest clues and contradictions on both sides of the debate. Clues: it was real. A shoot. 1. Bret's reaction was too real. Bret spat directly in Vince McMahon's face on live TV. He trashed the announce table, cameras, and monitors right after the bell rang. He later punched Vince backstage in front of multiple people, which Vince himself has admitted to. All of this seems way too legit, especially for a guy known for taking wrestling very seriously. Counter-argument: that's what makes it such a good work. If it was 1. Bret's old-school values made him the perfect guy to sell that kind of betrayal. You believed him because he believed himself. 2. Bret had creative control. In his contract, he legally had the right to reject the finish. Vince going behind his back was a real corporate betrayal. He did offer to drop the belt elsewhere, he just didn't want to do it in Canada. If this was a work, it would mean he willingly signed off on a plan to make himself look like he got screwed. Live against his own contract. But again, what better way to look like he had no part in it? 3. Earl Hebner swore on his kids. Bret claims Hebner promised he wouldn't betray him. Hebner swore on his children's lives. And yet, Hebner still called for the bell. Seems real, right? Unless he was in on it and playing the part too. Hebner's involvement adds credibility because fans believe he wouldn't do that unless forced. 4. The documentary timing wrestling with shadows. The camera crew just happened to be there. They caught real backstage footage right as it went down. That's either the most coincidental documentary of all time, or something smells worked. This moment lives in the gray area. Maybe the doc was real, but once Vince saw the opportunity, he leaned into the moment. 5. Bret actually went to WCW and floundered. If this was a work, wouldn't they have made sure Bret succeeded in WCW to maximize the long-term payoff? Instead, he was never used properly. WCW didn't capitalize on the buzz. He didn't even debut with the title. This seems to suggest WWF didn't want him to thrive after leaving. Clues: it was a work. The deep work theory 1. Vince McMahon was already thinking about becoming Mr. McMahon a few months later. Vince was in full heel mode feuding with Steve Austin. The evil boss character came directly out of Montreal and it worked perfectly. Could this have been step 1 in Vince becoming an on-screen villain? If so, the Screwjob becomes the launchpad for the most successful character in WWF history. 2. Bret didn't seem to hate Shawn forever for someone who screwed him. Bret eventually reconciled with Shawn. There was some legit heat, but never quite the blood feud you'd expect from a real betrayal. Eventually, they hugged on TV years later. Some think this was part of a long arc they always intended to pay off. Long-term storytelling? Or just maturity and time healing wounds? That's up for debate.
3. Bret drew the WCW letters in the air. Right after the bell, Bret used his fingers to spell WCW before smashing everything at ringside. Seems almost like a planned moment, like a promo, not a shoot reaction. That moment sold WCW to the audience. Why would Bret do that immediately unless it was part of the play? Point 4. Bret didn't drop the title the next night anyway. Bret could have dropped the belt on Raw the next night, like he originally offered. Instead, Vince chose to go with the Screwjob finish. Was this because Vince wanted the Screwjob because it was a better story that implies intent, not desperation? Which leans work. Point 5. Everyone benefited. Vince became the most hated and profitable heel ever. Shawn got nuclear heat and a bigger push. Bret left as a sympathetic figure with a huge payday. WWF got the edgiest story of the decade and turned the tide in the Monday Night Wars. The industry got its first truly viral controversy before going viral was a thing. That kind of payoff doesn't usually come from chaos, it usually comes from planning. The final contradiction, the Screwjob was to perfect. Real-life betrayals don't usually wrap up so neatly. A clear villain Vince, a fallen hero Bret, an opportunistic heel Shawn, a new narrative foundation for the next era of WWF. It played out like a movie. Real-life messes aren't usually that narratively tight, unless the mess was the script. So, was it a work, a shoot, or the greatest hybrid ever? Here's the mind-blowing possibility. Maybe it started as real, but once it began unfolding, they worked the reality. Maybe Vince didn't plan to screw Bret until the last minute, but once he did, he saw the money in it. Maybe Bret knew what was happening but chose to play it up for legacy's sake. That's the magic of the Montreal Screwjob. It sits in that uncanny space between fiction and reality. Not just a story, but a meta-story, a myth. Wrestling's version of a conspiracy theory. Everyone sees what they want to see in it, and the truth is almost irrelevant now.